the point is that they buy 10% of offsets or something for running their offices even, and then can claim that they are a carbon neutral organisation. Yeah,
with a full
they
page
really
ad.
do. With a full page ad, like the first carbon neutral gas company in Australia, there is one that said that. And it's just social licence.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we're going to be talking about hydrogen and carbon credits. Because, strap yourselves in, we are entering the great era of carbon fraud.
Hydrogen made with renewables is a zero-emissions fuel, but net zero by 2050 is a fraud, while hydrogen is made with fossil fuels. Genuine carbon credits can help offset emissions. Dodgy credits and dirty hydrogen are actually expanding demand for gas and coal.
At COP26, our government signed up to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. There's two ways to do it. Change what you do, or you buy credits to cover what you can't.
There's the potential to substantially reduce emissions, but importantly, allow us to strengthen industries.
The federal government says it's spending more than $4 billion to reduce pollution. Are those reductions real?
An announcement coming up later today. It's about hydrogen and carbon capture storage, total of about $500 million.
I don't know. I mean, you know, those green advocates are saying it's more money for the fossil fuel companies. That's probably true.
Yeah.
Instead of rushing to end fossil fuels as soon as we possibly can, we are about to witness, or are witnessing, a gold rush for carbon offsets, dirty hydrogen, and carbon capture and storage, all designed not to stop climate change, but to actually drive up the consumption of coal, oil, and gas. So today I'm delighted to introduce Richie Merzian, Director of the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program, and Polly Hemming, Advisor in the Climate Team, and they're going to help us unpack all the details. Richie, welcome. Polly, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Cheers.
First of all, Richie, let's start with explaining why hydrogen is part of decarbonising Australia's economy. How does it fit into this picture where we're aiming for net zero by 2050?
So hydrogen is a great alternative fuel. It's an energy carrier. You can make hydrogen in a zero emissions way, and when you use it, it can be zero emissions as well. So it makes sense to look at this as a potential climate solution, especially when otherwise we're relying heavily on fossil fuels.
And will it be kind of a big part of our future economy or a smaller part?
This is the big question. I think it'll have limited use. There'll be some places where hydrogen will be fit for purpose and others where it wouldn't. But the big question is how you make hydrogen, and that's really where things get complicated.
Yeah, well, before we dig into that, Polly, I want to come to you. I feel like I want to set the scene for all our listeners to begin with.
You buy a flight or a concert ticket, you're often asked if you want to pay a little extra to offset the carbon your activity will create.
The primary buyer of those credits has been the Australian government's $2.5 billion emissions reduction fund. The fund pays farmers and businesses to reduce or sequester greenhouse gas emissions.
Issues us with ACCUs. Each ACCU, which stands for Australian Carbon Credit Unit, represents the equivalent of 1 tonne of carbon dioxide.
Just to take things down to a really basic level, Polly, what is a carbon credit and why do we need them?
A carbon credit, I'll frame how carbon credits are made in Australia because that's where the conversation's going. But in Australia, we have this scheme called the Emissions Reduction Fund, and what that does is award or incentivise people for carrying out activities that reduce or avoid or store CO2 from various activities across the economy. So that might be like retaining vegetation from not cutting down some trees, or capturing methane from a landfill, or taking cattle off land so the vegetation regrows. And you have to do these things according to certain rules, and for every tonne of CO2 that you store in a tree or that you avoid being emitted, you are awarded by the government a carbon credit, 1 carbon credit for 1 tonne of CO2.
Okay.
And what you can do once you have earned those carbon credits is that you can either sell them back to the government, or else you can sell them on what we call the voluntary market to businesses who are looking to offset their emissions. And what that means is that business has emitted a tonne of CO2 through pollution, usually fossil fuels, and in order to stay under some sort of, arbitrary or compliance limit, they then purchase a carbon credit and theoretically offset that tonne of CO2. So it's like it never happened, in theory.
In theory.
Yep.
All right.
Australian peak body Smart Energy Council has today announced the certification of the actual AGL hydrogen refuelling station in Canberra. It will be the first project certified under the world-leading zero carbon certification scheme.
So, Richie, coming back to hydrogen, I've heard of green hydrogen and blue hydrogen and also this thing called clean hydrogen. What does the government mean when it talks about clean hydrogen?
It's a good place to start. Look, there are many colours in the hydrogen rainbow, but you can move all that to the side. There's really just 2 main types of hydrogen. Hydrogen you make with renewable energy to split water, H2O, into H2 and O, and you use the H2, the hydrogen, you can burn it at 0 emissions. 0 emissions to make it, 0 emissions to use it. That seems like a good idea. But there is another way to make hydrogen, which is using fossil fuels, and it's a very dirty process. So dirty that you would emit more than if you just burnt that fossil fuel directly. And so the government has said, let's just use all types of hydrogen and we'll label all types of hydrogen clean hydrogen. We'll promise to bury some of the emissions from the dirty hydrogen using fossil fuels, using carbon capture and storage, and therefore we can label all hydrogen that we make clean hydrogen, when we know clearly one is clean and one is not.
And we know it won't be clean because, Polly, we know carbon capture and storage has been a massive failure in Australia.
Oh, come on.
Oh, am I being a bit harsh?
Yeah, probably not harsh enough. It's been a massive failure everywhere.
Oh, not just Australia. Yeah, you're too
Australia,
right.
Everywhere. Billions and literally billions of dollars have been spent in Australia and overseas over decades trying to pursue this idea that you can capture a small amount of CO2 from gas production or coal production or oil recovery, and it just doesn't work. That's it. It just doesn't work. It's, it might work a little bit, but overall it's not achieving those goals. The net result is always more emissions in the atmosphere. And we've just seen time and time again, we see with the Gorgon CCS project in Western Australia, it's missed all its targets. Australia Institute research shows that CCS around the world has missed every target ever set for it. So it's not a rock solid solution.
It's not a winner.
It's not a winner.
No, it's not a winner.
But Richie, but we're going to create this hydrogen using gas and coal and then bury these emissions, but we're not really going to, are we? Because
No.
CCS is kind of this mythical unicorn.
Well, because CCS is a success when it comes to marketing these solutions. We used to call it clean coal because you'd promised to bury some emissions from coal-fired power underground. That never worked out. Now we're saying clean hydrogen because we're going to pretend to bury emissions from fossil fuel-based hydrogen production. But really, it's a marketing tool because the hydrogen industry right now is a very dirty industry because most hydrogen is made using fossil gas. And that's the problem. It's a bit cheaper to make fossil-based hydrogen than it is renewable hydrogen. And so the hype, the rush from the federal government is to lock in as much fossil fuel-based hydrogen as possible and pretend like it can deal with those emissions by burying some of it instead of actually investing in the clean solution available to us now.
So basically, Polly, what I'm hearing from Richie there is that whenever we hear the words clean hydrogen, I should be thinking in my head it's the same as clean coal. It's a myth. It's not really clean. It's just marketing. Is that what we're facing?
It's just marketing. We're handing in old homework. It's clean coal 2.0. It really is. It's exactly the same.
Old homework we failed.
Yeah, it's old bad homework we're handing in. Yeah, there's nothing new about it.
Okay.
An announcement coming up later today. It's about hydrogen and carbon capture storage, total of about $500 million.
There's obviously a lot of interest right around the world in the opportunities around hydrogen as a new low-emission fuel.
When it comes to hydrogen, you can make it from fossil fuels like coal or fossil gas, which means it causes pollution, or you can make it from wind and solar and hydro and biomass, which is zero carbon.
So then I want to get to the reason why we're doing this, I guess, Richie, is not to reduce emissions, but because we're still trying to pull out as much gas and coal from underground as we possibly can. Is that the idea?
It's just a more sophisticated way of denying climate change. It used to be outright denial and hell to leather in terms of expanding fossil fuels. Now the government has net zero by 2050, so it's proposing solutions, but they're not solutions that will help with net zero. They're solutions that enable more fossil fuel demand.
And when we say the government is, headed down this path, what are we talking of investment in zero emissions hydrogen compared to not clean hydrogen?
Yeah, this is where it becomes interesting because the funding is just labelled clean hydrogen. It's unclear exactly how it's divided, but we do know that some of the largest investments have been in dirty hydrogen. And a great example is that in January this year, the much applauded shipment of the first cargo of hydrogen to Japan was made using brown coal. So it's the dirtiest
coal.
The dirtiest possible way you can make hydrogen. They made it, and they didn't even bury the emissions. They just bought carbon credit.
Wonderful. So, Polly, that does bring us back to carbon credits. And I know the Australia Institute has recently released research that has questioned the integrity of carbon credits, and there's now a lot of questions around how that system works. I mean, Richie's just talking here about the fact that we're already exporting dirty hydrogen. What are the concerns with our carbon credit system at the moment?
So I'll just, going back to that emissions reduction fund, I'll just point out currently that the government is the biggest buyer of carbon credits in Australia. So they've committed to buying 209 million carbon credits that don't go towards anything. It's just incentivising abatement. What they're trying to do is get more carbon credits into this voluntary market where those big emitters can buy the carbon credits to offset their pollution. So currently the voluntary market, even though everyone gets very excited about it and there's talk about price in the market, about 1 million carbon credits are bought on the voluntary market every year. As you say, we've got significant concerns with the integrity of Australia's carbon credits. We have that research that shows that 1 in 5 carbon credits are hot air. There's other research out there that suggests that it could be about 75% of carbon credits are hot air.
Wow.
And when I say hot air, I'm talking about something called additionality. So the whole point of the Emissions Reduction Fund is to incentivise reductions from various activities that weren't going to happen anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So you are incentivising activity that goes beyond business as usual. And that's a really important concept, that additionality. So the report we did showed that the carbon credits that farmers were getting for not clearing land were non-additional because they were never going to clear that land anyway. So the carbon was always going to stay stored in those trees. So going back to what the government's trying to do, despite everyone raising these issues with integrity, they're not pressing pause, they're not addressing any of these issues, they're just going hell for leather, trying to, and these are the Angus Taylor's own words, like slash crediting times, fast track methods to get new activities across the economy to be awarded with carbon credits that they can sell ideally on the voluntary market. So there's all these things that have kind of happened in the market recently that have meant that there's going to be more supply of credits available to the voluntary market. And that's really important because it's really important to remember we're in the middle of a gas-fired recovery, and that's in inverted commas. There's no recovery happened there. And so we've got really big emitters like Woodside making final investment decisions on things like the Scarborough development that are going to result in billions of tonnes of CO2. And even though in Australia we don't really have any regulations around, how much organisations or big emitters can emit. We do nominally, but they're not really enforced.
Not enforced, so it doesn't really matter.
But we're looking at these gas companies emitting so much that eventually they're probably going to hit even those really generous baselines or caps, if you like. It's probably a better description. And they're going to have to offset some of their emissions.
This is a great opportunity for Australia here. We can produce it not just for export, but importantly for manufacturing here of products like urea and aluminium. Over time, there's great opportunities to decarbonise that gas, and there's a number of projects in the 50 million that we are putting forward here that can help to decarbonise that gas production.
So going back to the government trying to increase supply, with their fast-tracking new methods and everything, when you increase supply of a product, what happens?
The price decreases.
Oh, yeah, the price decreases.
I've listened to Richard Dennis.
And what's the easiest way to increase supply of something? Is to cut corners. It's to lower the quality, right? So rather than actually ensuring integrity in this scheme and addressing the concerns of people, the government looks like it's lowering the quality, increasing supply, so the price will drop. So these big emitters like Woodside, Origin, Shell, whoever.
It's going to be cheaper for them.
It's going to be cheaper for them. Yep.
That's the price signal we want to send. Please pollute more.
Well, that's the thing. With carbon credits, you want the price to be high. If you're using carbon credits as offset, you want the price to be high because then it is cheaper to actually make those structural adjustments in your business that mean you reduce emissions and you are relying less on carbon credits. If you make them deliberately cheap, then where's the incentive to actually change your business model? There is none. It's just cheaper to keep going business as usual. So we've got these non-additional credits that are now cheap, and we're in a gas-fired recovery, but we've also committed to net zero, Eb.
Those things seem like they might be on a collision course.
Yeah.
Price rises at the petrol pump make politicians nervous.
The government is now under pressure to cut fuel excise to give everyday motorists a break.
And today, Scott Morrison declined to rule out cutting it in the budget.
The budget is coming up at the end of this month, but I think Australians understand.
Yes or no?
No, the answer is the budget's at the end of this month.
Richie, we're 1 week out from the budget, literally 1 week because we're recording this on Tuesday. What are we anticipating in the budget based on past performance of this government in terms of hydrogen and these kinds of things that we've been talking about today?
I mean, this will be a gas-fired budget. Like, since the government announced its net zero plan just ahead of the Glasgow talks in October, we've had 700 million dedicated to clean hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. Like, that's just since the net zero claim a few months ago, let alone what's in this budget. Again, today there was another announcement for additional funding for gas. Whatever the problem is that the government has, gas is the solution.
Answer.
It's the solution, right? It's what do you have? A pandemic, high energy prices, a net zero plan, and now a war.
Gas.
It's always gas.
It's obvious, Richie.
It's always gas. And so we will see this. It'll be peppered right across the budget. We'll also probably see additional support for liquid fuels, which the government has now realised it's quite insecure on, and maybe even lowering the fuel excise as well that we all face at the Bowser. So there'll be a lot more support for fossil fuels in one way or another.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Polly, but the whole idea of carbon credits and offsets in general, isn't it supposed to be like a last resort for industries and companies that have tried literally everything else to decarbonise and they just can't make it? And so there's a role for offsets in helping achieve that. They're supposed to be a last resort.
Yeah, exactly. The idea, well, offset's really only applicable to a very kind of narrow scenario, I guess. They're not a go-to license to pollute because they're cheap. The idea is that you implement this framework called the hierarchy of mitigation, which is you get, as you just said, you reduce, avoid, just try and do everything you can, and then if you're in one of those really genuinely hard to abate sectors, like agriculture is genuinely hard to abate because we don't actually have anything that can eradicate or reduce methane emissions from cows. You know, the government talks big on seaweed, but it's not actually doing a whole lot there. And even then, you know, we're not sure what the results will be. So offsets should only be used in that very narrow scope. Using offsets to actually justify gas expansion is not really what they're intended for. And to be clear, I don't know any fossil fuel company that is suggesting offsetting all their emissions from their extraction, production, subsequent combustion and consumption. Maybe there would be an argument. No, there wouldn't be an argument there. But the point is that they buy 10% of offsets or something for running their offices even, and then can claim that they are a carbon neutral organisation. Yeah,
with a full
they
page
really
ad.
do. With a full page ad, like the first carbon neutral gas company in Australia, there is one that said that. And it's just social licence. So it's not just the direct subsidies or the fact that these, you know, Santos can now access the emissions reduction fund through generating carbon credits with CCS. It's actually the social licence that offsets give big emitters. Storytelling is a huge part of our culture, and offsets actually afford big emitters a nice story about planting trees that goes an enormous way to convincing their shareholders or their customers even that they're doing the right thing on climate.
And I heard you earlier this week on the radio talking about the fact that farmers are obviously one of the key constituencies involved in generating carbon credits, but also potentially the industry that's going to need them. Are there going to be any left by the time Woodside and Chevron have bought up all the cheap carbon credits that Angus Taylor's generating?
Yeah, well, this is a really odd tension within the emissions reduction fund, and the government is trying to be all things to all people in the way that it talks about it. So even in the net zero plan and the way Angus Taylor talks on the radio, this is a fantastic revenue stream for farmers. They're going to be making $1 bazillion by 2050 from selling soil carbon credits.
We got rid of the carbon tax, and we've outperformed so many other countries in the world. And we've done that through the deployment of technologies, through the deployment of the Emissions Reduction Fund, which farmers are really benefiting from now and will benefit from much more in the coming years. That's the way to do it.
Which is nice in theory, but farmers in the agriculture sector actually come under Australia. We've got an economy-wide emissions reduction target, an economy-wide net zero target. That means the agriculture sector is going to need to find reductions. And as I said, there's really not many places you can go. You know, you can electrify machinery. We know that's not going to happen because the government doesn't particularly like electrification. You can try and reduce emissions in terms of the way you farm or the way you apply fertiliser. But we love beef in Australia, and when there's just nothing you can do to reduce methane emissions apart from that seaweed I mentioned, really offsetting is the only option left to farmers in Australia. So if they're selling all their carbon credits, they can't claim that abatement for themselves. That's something that's called double counting, which is very much frowned upon. Some people try and get away with it, but it's just, the maths doesn't add up. You can only count 1 tonne of carbon once. So I really wonder if anyone has actually, warned farmers about the short-term benefits of getting a whole lot of cash for your carbon credits versus the long-term costs of not being able to own that abatement for yourself.
Down the line.
Just runs reforestation projects in the wheat belt of Western Australia, generating carbon credits for sale into the Emissions Reduction Fund. We selected the less productive parts of the farm that would grow trees well.
Richie, this all strikes me as very concerning for Australia. What does the picture look like worldwide?
The picture Australia's putting forward is that it's all systems go. When we were in Glasgow, day 2, the Minister for Energy was there next to the CEO of Santos, declaring that they'd be beneficiaries of carbon credits through carbon capture and storage, which they'd rushed to agree to just a month before. The problem exists overseas, but there's a lot more interest in certifying where hydrogen comes from. So the Europeans have a certification scheme that they're moving ahead with. In Australia, it's on go slow. So we don't have a certification scheme at the national level, and there's a big question as to why it's taking so long to get there. In terms of carbon credits, the hierarchy of mitigation, as Polly outlined, is better outlined in a number of other jurisdictions. But again, there are serious issues, and a global market is being built right now under the Paris Agreement that might inherit many of the same problems that we have here.
So potentially at the election, we could see a change of government. I mean, how big of a problem is this for a potential incoming Labor government to deal with once it's in power, Richie?
A big problem. Like right now, this is manufactured, this problem, out of the direct action climate approach of the current Morrison and the current Liberal National government. There is an opportunity to correct the record in terms of the integrity in the carbon market, and that requires a comprehensive review of how we go about creating and regulating and purchasing these carbon credits. The Labor Party have said that they will undertake a review, but it needs to be comprehensive. It needs to be legitimate. Otherwise, they will inherit these problems, and then it'll be their problem as much as it's the current government's one. And the same thing goes for hydrogen. We need a certification scheme for hydrogen so we know where we're getting our hydrogen from, and we need to limit investment to zero emissions hydrogen made from renewables.
These schemes, the hydrogen certification, even hydrogen production, the enormous complexity of carbon credits in Australia, they're completely unnecessary. We buy into them and we discuss the merits of all of them. If we just had rigorous emissions reduction requirements and a phase out of fossil fuels, we wouldn't have to have this conversation. And I think what's really important and what people should possibly be angry about is that literally billions of dollars are being spent on non-solutions that could be spent on very simple solutions such as renewable energy and electric vehicles. So these funds or these grants are actually at the expense of proven solutions. We go round and round in circles with these hugely complex, ridiculous schemes when actually the answer is very simple. We're just overcomplicating it.
Polly's bang on. Like, solving climate change is easy. It is easy to solve climate change. You get to 100% renewable electricity, you electrify everything, and you work on forestry. Like, that's it. Fossil fuels are not part of the solution in any form or in any way, and we shouldn't be offsetting and we shouldn't be using them to make other things.
Hydrogen made with renewables is a zero-emissions fuel, but net zero by 2050 is a fraud, while hydrogen is made with fossil fuels. Genuine carbon credits can help offset emissions. Dodgy credits and dirty hydrogen are actually expanding demand for gas and coal. Unless we produce zero-emissions hydrogen and restore quality to carbon credits, Australia is just fueling a net zero fraud.
This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 22nd of March 2022, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. If you want to donate to help get this ad on TV, you can visit our website and follow the prompts. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a _N_T. Richie Merzian is at Richie Merzian, and Polly Hemming is at Polly J Hemming. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macy. You can find her at Jennifer Macy, with additional editing by Louise Osborne. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Don't forget to leave us a review if you enjoy the podcast. It helps other people to find us. Stay safe out there, and thanks for listening.